Well, welcome to a vacation in Southern California. The rain all went away for a while, so having a good day down here visiting family and doing some work with biblical training. But today's blog is on Colossians 1:12, and the title is Let's Pretend You're a Translator. You know, one of the problems that we're having is in first year Greek, we generally accept very, very awkward wooden translations because we want this, as a teacher, we want to know that the student knows this is a participle or this is an aorist or something like that. And we tend to stop at that point. And I am being completely convinced that especially in first year Greek class, what we ought to be doing is requiring two levels of translation. One, word for word, awkward, kind of to let your teacher know that you know what it is. But then we really should, from day one, be requiring students to give a polished translation. How would you say this if you actually were going to read your translation in English? So pretend you're a member today of the CBT, the Committee on Bible Translation, the committee that controls the NIV. And let's look at Colossians 1:2. For your first pass through your word-for-word translation, so you're already going to start with a problem because you have the metacharas in verse 11, but does that go with verse 11 or go with verse 12? But let's, for the time being, put it with verse 12. So with joy, giving thanks to the Father, the one enabling, or participle right, you all, you plural, into the share of the inheritance of the saints in light, or in the light, actually. Okay, now that's not English, but that's generally kind of what we do in first year Greek class. But let's go through and let's pick this apart. First of all, you've got to decide whether metacharas goes with verse 11 or verse 12. And you just have to decide based on Pauline style more than anything else. The NIV puts it with verse 12, so that's fine. So with joy, or you could say joyfully, which is how you'd say it in English, giving thanks to the Father. When you get to the participle, hikanao, you have another choice though, don't you? BDAG glosses this word as to qualify, and a lot of translations go with that, to giving thanks to the Father who qualified you all. Well, that sounds like somehow I deserve the inheritance, and I really don't think that qualified is even close to the right translation. Some of the other translations say he has enabled us, and I think that's much more, shall we say, theologically sensitive to what's going on. I'm not qualified to receive my inheritance, but the Lord has made it possible for me to receive an inheritance. And so enabled is, I think, a much better translation. Enabled, and then humas, you have to decide whether you're going to make it clear that Paul is talking to the Colossians as a church and it's plural. And when in our Western culture where we tend to see everything is so individualized, we may say the you and think it's you singular, but it's you all, it's you plural. So you have to decide what you're going to do with that. And again, translators are traders. You can't convey all the meaning of the Greek in English, but you have to decide, well, is this important enough to kind of maybe make a little more awkward English for all of you, or from the South, y'all, I guess, which is what I tend to do. But then we get to the prepositional phrase, eishtein merida, and that's the hardest one. Into the portion. Well, that's not English even remotely, right? Into the portion of the inheritance of the saints in the light. Well, most translations, I think, properly go with something like to share in, because that's what you're getting a share. You're sharing in something. But again, let me emphasize this, and maybe this is I'm beating this hobby horse to death, but it's really important. I find myself slightly annoyed when I keep hearing people say, "Well, I choose word-for-word translations because it reflects the Greek structure." When? How do you know? In every single verse in the Bible, the translators have to leave the Greek structure in order to make it English. There is no way that you would get from to share back into the portion, which is what the Greek is, right? And there's no way that you would actually see the Greek structure behind the verb to share. And so this problem of thinking that, well, I'll get these word-for-word translations because they reflect the underlying Greek and Hebrew structures. No, they don't. And maybe in some macro level, maybe if you already know Greek and you know the actual Greek verse, you can look at it and you can see the structure. But if you know Greek, you should be reading Greek. So that's really an irrelevant argument, I think. But you're going to have to decide how to very idiomatically translate into the portion. All right, that's actually the hardest part in this verse. Then it's of the inheritance of the saints, and you have to decide whether you want to use the word saints or something that's a little more descriptive, but that's not a big deal. And then you end up in the light. Well, what on earth does in the light mean? Well, you can just say in the light, and it obviously modifies the preceding word, the saints. So it has something to do about saints and light. But what? Building a house down there. What's the relationship? You can say into the light. The problem is that doesn't mean anything, right? And the whole point of translation is to convey the meaning of the original authorial intent into a target language. And if you simply say in the light, it just doesn't mean anything. The NASB is really odd here. It's in the light with a capital L. I'm assuming because of how they capitalize things that they're thinking this is a reference to God. But that seems really bizarre and quite overly interpretive for something like the NASB. Of all the translations, I think the NLT actually has done the best job here. It said, He has enabled you to share in the inheritance that belongs to His people who live in the light. The NIV talks about the kingdom of the light. But I just don't think you can say in the light because it just doesn't mean anything. But anyway, it's kind of fun just to pretend you're on the committee with us and to recognize that the goal is not just to replace Greek words with English words and awkward syntax, but the whole point of translation is to convey the authorial intent in a way that makes sense and is understandable in the target language. I'd really encourage first-year Greek students and first-year Greek teachers to really make sure the students are doing it both levels of translation, just to get into the habit of that from day one. Anyway, greetings from California.